Shall we open this up now to some questions from the audience? I want to thank the panelists again for the fantastic contributions. But I'm sure we have questions. We have about half an hour exactly to our break. So loads of time to think and talk. Yeah, shall we pass the mic first? Yeah.
And the mic for you for this one.
Yes.
Yes,
Not new.
thank you very much for excellent presentations. As a social scientist, I'm always wary of interpretations and theory which focus on too much on individuals. I think one of the reasons why Russia's poorly understood, as I think it is at the moment, is because far too much analysis focuses on the personality of Mr. Putin. So I wonder whether, in fact, instead of approaching it as the face-to-face interaction of two leaders, it's better to see it as the interaction of two teams, because the preparation of these meetings was done quite collectively, and the assessment afterwards and the way the kind of dynamic was maintained was also because of the collective assessments on both sides, including the interpreters, very important people, and the experts who were there, and that this is really the process that developed. It was an interaction and then of a team, and then between the meetings of the two leaders, other members of the teams were meeting as well and building up a momentum and deepening the process. But I think if one focuses only on the individuals, I wonder whether there's danger of losing that dimension of this important process.
Who wants first?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I actually totally agree with that. I think one of the things we have in IR is a little bit of a leader fetish, where we focus on the people that we think are making the decisions. And in some instances, I think that's right to have that, because there are certain instances of history, Chamberlain and Hitler interacting, that's a moment where it was those two guys that really made a big difference. But having said that, I do think, particularly in the build-up to these summits, looking at the teams is crucial. Looking at the translators' notes and diaries and memoirs have been some of the most useful sources for me personally. One of the difficulties, though, is simply that there's less written about those teams, right? So one of the, as a consumer of history, not a historian myself, I often have the problem of trying to find the sources that will speak to a lot of the things that you're talking about that are going on behind the scenes, where not as much is written down, precisely because these people are not the leaders, right? But I couldn't agree more that, I mean, face-to-face interactions as a general theory is going to apply to the lower level people as well as the highest levels, absolutely.
I certainly agree with that. And I think that one of the points that one should stress, particularly about Reagan and Gorbachev, is that both of them, by their actions and by the actions of their foreign ministers, encouraged much more contact, not only broadly with them, but specifically with the experts. You mentioned the agreements on Angola and other regional things. This came out of regular meetings at the deputy minister level of people responsible for those. When I proposed that we propose these, about half of the assistant secretaries in the State Department said no, and particularly the assistant secretary for Latin American affairs. He said, I'm not going to talk to the Russians about our hemisphere. And Schultz said, yes, you are. We're going to start this. And in 2 years, we had an agreement on Nicaragua and so on. So, I must say, this was my idea to start this. Schultz enthusiastically agreed with it. But speaking more broadly, this was not only in the regional affairs. We had, I think, very, very productive negotiations with Ambassador Adamishin, who was handling human rights, the most sensitive of the issues, directly, because we were going off the record and doing it privately. And more broadly, and the reason I mentioned the exchanges agreement before, we were opening up, encouraging Gorbachev to open up his own society and to bring others in. And so this was very much a part, I think, on both of the leaders, because the problems we had before, the contacts were just very limited. We in the embassy in Moscow were not able to talk to the people in the Central Committee. We would have only the most formal contacts with the military and so on. And suddenly, the leaders were encouraging in-depth things. And obviously, many of these agreements could not have been worked out without that. So that's absolutely right. Now, I did want to, because this is related, to say something about Gorbachev's proposal in January for the gradual elimination of nuclear weapons. You're quite right about Weinberger and Casey and their interpretation. That was not Reagan's interpretation. But the fact was that Gorbachev made that proposal publicly, and this was used as an argument by others against it. I was called out of a meeting to go to the White House and to say this message was in, and I looked at it, and the first question I said was, is it private or is it public? And the person in the Situation Room that received it says, well, it's out on TOS right now. And I said, we have to be careful. When Reagan saw it, however, he was impressed. And he said, this is the first time a Soviet leader has proposed the elimination of nuclear weapons. We came back from that meeting, and I remember Schultz told McFarlane, I think the president's on to something. And this did make a difference to Reagan, and the reason Schultz went to the Soviets and said, look, why don't you do some of these things private? It was that you would get much further. In fact, it was one of our efforts at that point to get more of these contentious issues in private, and particularly new ideas, to try them out. Eventually, we moved to that. But it was a handicap, actually, in our reception, the way he did it.
I think that you're right, Julian, that we shouldn't concentrate only on the supreme leaders meeting with each other. I think one thing that comes out of all of this is how important Secretary of State Schultz was and his whole department, and on the other side, Shevardnadze. They really nagged those supreme leaders. They agitated them. They went out of their way to annoy them until they got their leaders to accept the radical reforms that they wanted. The fact was, though, that these were the supreme leaders, were general leaders, who weren't only responsible for foreign affairs. And Gorbachev was attempting a transformation of his whole country. That wasn't the case for Ronald Reagan, except in a much more narrow sense, so that Shevardnadze and Schultz could afford to be more radical, but they were very, very active in pushing the line. And I think the greatness of Reagan and the greatness of Gorbachev was that they ultimately accepted this argument, and they rejected the line that was being pushed by the Soviet Defense Ministry on one side and the CIA on the other. But so there was the formation of a radical consensus. And the question is, when the USSR was giving way so rapidly on so many matters to the other side, why was this allowed? Why did the Politburo go along with it? Well, I would say there are one answer to that is that Gorbachev remodeled the Politburo and got more radicals into it. But very few of the newcomers to the Politburo were as radical as he, and certainly not as radical as Shevardnadze. So I would come back down to that lower level again, that the economic malaise of the Soviet Union gave the Politburo little choice but to say, at least this man is giving us an economic breathing space to save Soviet communism. So I think he could always play that card inside the Politburo. So yes, you've got to go below the level of the individual leader, but you can't exclude that individual leadership factor either.
After all, the decision to involve others was a decision of these leaders.
We have a question.
Thanks. I've got a deeply unprofound comment about Marcus's statement, which is, I can remember so many times going to meetings with interlocutors who I knew before and really disliked, and thinking, oh God, not him or her again. So much nicer to have been dealing with them on the telephone. Anyway, just on the substance of what we're talking about, of course, a very, very striking feature of the Geneva summit was that, as you've all said, this was a meeting which took place after a very long gap in meetings at that level between the United States and Soviet leaderships. And as we've been also saying, intelligence and information on each side was faulty and in some places non-existent. So you had a situation in which a great deal turned on what we're calling personal chemistry and what each said to the other, because there was so little out there in terms of underpinnings. It's not a very good parallel, but nowadays in the European Union, God save us, we have meetings every week with our counterparts from prime ministers down, I'm exaggerating slightly, anyway, every month from prime ministers downwards. And what shall I say, the policy underpinnings of the discussions on each side are extremely well known. And in those circumstances, of course, you may have good personal chemistry with one or other interlocutor and less good with another, and that's a factor. But in those circumstances, that component, it seems to me, is a lot less significant than it was at Geneva.
Who wants to take that?
I think that's right. I mean, I think one of the really interesting thing about the Geneva case is, and the whole Cold War, really. I mean, you have these nice conditions where they're really ripe for interpersonal mattering, and so I totally believe that's true. Now, why it was so ripe, I think part of it is the structural situation that you alluded to. Partly it's because the intentions assessment from Washington and Moscow were faulty, but of course they didn't really realize that at the time, right? And so it's one of these instances where we look back and it seems like the conditions were very much ripe for interpersonal mattering. I'm not sure if at the time they had the sense of that or not. I'd be curious to hear what Jack and Robert have to say. But from my perspective as a social scientist looking back, and because this is what we do, we go back 40, 50 years once things are declassified and look at them, the conditions were ripe for interpersonal. It seems obvious now. I just don't know if that was true back then. I'd be curious to hear what others think about that.
I don't think either one knew the other very well. Obviously they didn't, and that was going to take time. But, one thing I haven't mentioned is that within a week after we got back from Geneva, when Reagan was still resting on his ranch, celebrating Thanksgiving in California, he wrote Gorbachev a letter immediately following up on Geneva, and I happened to draft that letter, and what we tried to do was to select two things that were particularly sensitive and see if we could make progress. And one of them was Afghanistan, and the other was arms control and SDI. And what he asked Gorbachev in the letter regarding Afghanistan, can't we find a way to negotiate your withdrawal with guarantees from us that we recognize your security problem on your southern border. I forget the exact words, but the idea being that we would not take advantage of a Soviet withdrawal, and we would agree to that. And by the way, if he had come with the agreement eventually he made that both sides stop supplying arms, we would have accepted it, hands down. He didn't reply to that directly. The other was, can we figure out a way to conduct research on strategic defense that is not threatening to the other? And Gorbachev never directly answered either one of those. And that's one of the reasons things got slowing down in '86, along with the delay in setting a time for a summit. So, yeah, I think there were a lot of misunderstandings early on. I would say in general, don't rely all that much on what Bob Gates was saying or Weinberger, because time and time again, Reagan was turning these down privately. And actually these assessments, Reagan wasn't accepting a lot of them. Actually Reagan didn't read these long CIA assessments. Usually when I was working on the NSC, I would send them in with brief summaries and my own opinion of them, and probably usually he didn't read much beyond that. We also brought in a lot of outside experts, so to talk to him. So and I think Gorbachev, well, I can't speak as to where his influences were coming, but yeah, I think I cannot say that because of one meeting they really understood each other. That had to develop over time. There was one thing that I think Reagan did have that most American presidents haven't. People used to denigrate him because he was a professional actor. And I said being a professional actor made it much easier for him to put himself in Gorbachev's shoes. Even though they didn't fit all that well, he could understand that he could have a certain empathy, which is, of course, not the same as sympathy. And I think that helped, because most of our presidents really have trouble understanding people coming from foreign cultures. They really do. And yet this is one of the things that fascinated Reagan. And I think when you that is part of it.
Yeah, we have one question. And another one over there. Shall we take these two questions together, since
Yes.
we have the mic at the same row?
Thank you.
And then-
Sorry, I was curious if you could say a little bit more about the creation of trust in face-to-face interaction. Do we know how this works more generally, and why does it work in some cases but not in others? So I was thinking, so this was obviously a successful example, but if you think about the Arab-Israeli interactions, for example, we've also seen face-to-face interactions, but they haven't worked.
And let's take the other question as well.
Jack, I wonder if you could maybe say a word or two about the series of papers that I think Bud McFarlane had you draw up in the fall of 1985, leading up to Geneva, that I think you may have called at one point Soviet Union 101.
On trust, that's a very broad topic, a lot of things. First of all, one of the things we were trying to do was to put more of our diplomacy, started out with private consultation. And instead of playing a zero-sum game publicly, each one making proposals that are supposed to be embarrassing to the other just to prove that they're more for peace than the other, we had to get off that zero-sum syndrome. And part of it was, before we did things publicly, we consult on them. In fact, the reason we had such a successful exchange agreement at Geneva was, before we proposed anything, we started consulting with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, saying, look, we'd like to do some of these things. These are some of our ideas. Tell us if you think they're workable, and maybe you will have some. And they did. And we worked out so that we actually were working off. Then we worked our bureaucracy, at least on our side, and I suppose they did too, to get these proposals put together. And only when we had a general agreement that we wanted to move in that direction did Reagan make a speech about it, which he did. On regional affairs, again, we were setting up these consultations and trying to get certain messages across before we made a speech. And the other aspect of it was to deal with what had been considered violations and try to get that put behind us. But, you know, even agreeing on matters of principle, like a nuclear war cannot be won, this is also part of it. But you had to begin to create the idea that you are not trying to do the other side in. Now, so I think that's part of that. And I would also say, you know, I don't think we should look at this as a sporting match and where one side is making points, the other side is losing them. You know, I was instructed to try to develop an agenda which would be in the Soviet interest. The fact was, Soviet policies were not in the long-term interest of the Soviet Union. And Reagan, you know, among other things, he gave direct orders. We're not going for superiority. That's not, you know, an achievable thing. It's not going to get us anywhere. In other words, now you could, obviously we're going to have arguments over what was that. And we are going to treat them as equals, so we're not going to question the legitimacy, you know, of the Soviet government. So there were aspects of our policy which were aimed at trying to find the maximum number of areas where our interests coincided and to concentrate on those. And obviously it had to be a step-by-step process. Now, in terms of the individuals, the fact that one would make a promise and then carry it out was enormously important. And now the second question regarding what we call Soviet Union 101, which is the way we number an introductory course in most of our universities. Yes, I was instructed to prepare these papers for Reagan when the meeting with Geneva was announced. And there were, I think, about 24 of them. I wrote a few myself, 2 or 3, but most we got from either the CIA or the State Department, Bureau of Intelligence Research. But I did not do it in a bureaucratic way. I called Gates and the CIA and Armacost in the State Department, and I said, I'm going to send you a list of topics. And I want you to pick your best analyst to write a paper. And I want that to come up with no changes other than maybe for grammar and spelling. It's not to be a coordinated intelligence paper. It will have the name of the author. And I reserve the right to pick the one I send to the president. I reserve the right to combine them if necessary. But if the president has any questions, that analyst is going to come up and answer them. I don't want any more of this, you know, coordinated nonsense, I might say, that comes usually out of the intelligence community. And it worked, and about half from the State Department, about half from the CIA. They were excellent papers in many cases, and he would read them, annotate them, and if he had questions, we would bring that analyst right to the White House to sit down with him and answer the question, and not go through all of the of that. One thing about Reagan, he was an avid reader, he was an avid writer, in the sense that he did keep his diaries. He wrote letters every day, and things like the memo I quoted from, he would sit down and write. And this is something that a lot of people probably didn't appreciate at the time.
That was very, very interesting what you told us about the the memos. I would only add to that we're talking about a whole process of growing mutual awareness in answer to both the questions. Trust came from Soviet public figures going to the States and seeing for themselves in a way that only a few privileged diplomats had previously done, and vice versa. Americans going in huge numbers and seeing for themselves what the USSR was really like, and finding that Russian people didn't have green antennae coming out of the top of their heads as in a sort of really bizarre comic book fiction. So that collective national contact, I think, is extremely important, and it was almost like a drug in the late 1980s. It was almost like drinking alcohol for the first time. It was so dizzying for both sides to find out that they were. What was that remark of Reagan when he met Dobrynin for the first time? And then someone told him that Dobrynin was a communist, and Reagan said, well, really? Was he? I can't remember the exact words he used, but surely that's not possible. He seemed such a nice guy. A lot of that mutual non-comprehension went by the wayside for those brief years in the late 1980s, and I think that was a very, very important aspect of the building up of trust. It was also important that both teams had their deniers. That Reagan and his supporters could always say, look, we can only go so far. You do realize that Casey and Weinberger are in this administration too. They could always use that. And so too could Gorbachev on the other side. So there were personnel games being played on both sides that made it easier for the two principal leaders to navigate their way through the shoals of difficulty, because this was a transformation in international relations, an end to an appallingly dangerous period in the history of humanity that we're talking about. It was an extraordinary period, historic change, and it couldn't have been pulled off unless a consensus was built in the true great superpower publics.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes. We have one question there. Is it still? Yeah?
Do you want me to answer that one?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Just really quickly. So I could talk about this for an hour, and you would not want me to, but the problem of sort of when trust develops and when it doesn't is a big sort of research project in international relations. Not yet, but it will be soon. The way I look at it is empathy is required for trust. So the theory that I have is about empathy and intention understanding. The problem with the trust building is that there tends to be empathy gaps that develop between in-group versus out-group. So this is the big explanation for why Americans cared about the Paris bombing but not the Beirut bombing. It was because the Parisians are part of the in-group, people in Beirut were not. So that's the empathy gap. And so one of the areas of research is how face-to-face interaction can lessen that gap. So from my perspective, you have to do empathy first before you're going to get trust. In the face-to-face context, trust as a general rule will increase if face-to-face contact happens. So they do these games where they have them play face-to-face and non-face-to-face and economic exchange games, and people are more trusting in the face-to-face condition, holding all else constant. So that shows that there's some promise there. Two other things. So Kelman has been doing a lot of problem-solving workshops with Israelis and Palestinians for decades, where he basically has people get together and they work on common problems. Sometimes it's like a math problem. Other times it's a political problem. And he shows that over time they start to everyday sort of Israelis and everyday Palestinians start to empathize a little bit better with each other. So that might be one model. The other model, I think, is through a mediator. So Camp David, 1979, Sadat and Begin, I don't think ever trusted each other, but they trusted Carter individually. Or at least Sadat did. Begin probably did a little bit from time to time. And so he was able to essentially build relational empathy and relational trust. At least that's the way I would look at it. So I think, when two entities or two individuals can't trust one another, can't empathize with one another, I don't think that means that all is lost. I think a person in the mediator role who's capable of empathizing and capable of being a trusting figure can sort of bridge that gap.
Thank you. Building on that, and particularly what Robert Service said, it's another way of analysing this, isn't there? Which would be a kind of group analytic approach about grandiosity leading to euphoria. That the underlying factor is the huge anomaly of Soviet pretensions and nuclearized competition, which was bound, in retrospective we see, was bound to fail in a bad, ugly, warlike way, or by economic collapse, or in this good way. And when that begins to happen, for all the reasons that the teams and the individuals that we mentioned, then something comes out of that. Which I can remember at the time, this extraordinary sense of, oh, this is wonderful. It's like having a sort of thorn withdrawn from a flesh that you didn't know was there, and you realize the dimensions of the relief. But then where that seems to go is this euphoria. This is so wonderful, we're wonderful, the world can be absolutely different. And it leads to this grandiose approach. These two people are going to abolish nuclear weapons everywhere. And all the problems that would involve, other decision makers, the problems of verification, enforcement, there are as nothing, and there are STI is another grandiose option. And in effect, there seems to be a desire and a magic belief that geopolitical competition can be ended by this sudden euphoric gush of goodwill from the heads of these two systems meeting. And you see it get progressively stronger between Geneva and Reykjavik. And then, of course, as historians might have expected, this isn't possible to last. Normal geopolitical power competition in the world reestablishes itself, with the sort of bad feelings as a result after the euphoria that we are now dealing with in relation to current unpleasantness in Eurasia. I mean, isn't that at least as plausible a pattern?
Who's going to take this?
I'm not sure that I grasp exactly what you're asking. Maybe maybe it's the I was awake all night on a flight, and maybe if
I'll have a
get
go
the views
while
of
you
the
gather
others,
your thoughts. I see what you're getting at, and I realize that it flows from some of the things I was saying, but what I would counterpose to what you're saying is that this period of intense euphoria was counterbalanced by the collapse of the Soviet economy, and it couldn't last for internal reasons. It was an unsustainable process in the long term for the Soviet Union, unless the Soviet Union totally transformed itself and managed to hold on to its economic reforms, which it didn't do. Gorbachev regarded total economic reform of the Soviet system as anathema. He likened it, when he was talking to his advisors, to a second collectivization, only in reverse. So he was horrified at the idea of the introduction of capitalism. He wanted to save some sort of residual communism, so that that euphoria was doomed. But it wasn't a process which suddenly happened. While all of these great changes were being made in international relations, the Soviet economy was falling through the floorboards. I do remember in 1990 going to Moscow for an academic conference and going to one of those huge dairy supermarkets. Do you remember those dairy supermarkets that only sold dairy products, yogurt, kefir, milk, butter? There were 20 assistants standing round with peaked hats and white uniforms, and not a single litre of milk, not a single gram of butter in the whole of the supermarket. It was it's an economic disaster zone. So we're talking about an astonishing period where great changes are being made in international relations, and the leadership hasn't got a clue how it's going to hold on to its material level of consumption to the satisfaction of its millions of no wonder Soviet people regard Gorbachev with some disfavor to this day. Their mothers and fathers can remember what a dreadful time they had in the late 1980s.
Well, it got even more dreadful for Russians, at least. Of course, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the 90s were a period of great, almost chaos and near anarchy. And I think one of the reasons that Putin is popular today, by the way, I don't think it's 80-90%, as some of the polls show, but outside Moscow and Petersburg, I think he is genuinely popular because he did bring a certain amount of order to them, and they also view him as having restored Russia's honor and respect when in many of the actions of the West were interpreted as humiliating. The triumphalism and so on. And of course, yes, there was euphoria, certainly in most of the Soviet Union as communism was breaking up. The Russians and others were thinking, well, we'll be living like Europeans very shortly if we throw off communism. And of course, that was never a realistic expectation. So yeah, there are definitely elements of euphoria and then disappointment, but I think these have and a lot of it is economic. But I think in the post Soviet period, it has been the triumphalism of the West, a whole series of decisions that were made that were interpreted by Russia as hostile. In many cases, they were not intended to be. But if you look at it from the Russian standpoint, the West did take advantage. And it is quite true, though there was no legally binding agreement not to expand NATO to the east, the first Bush and Gorbachev made an agreement at Yalta in December '89 that if the Soviet Union loosened its grip on Eastern Europe, the U.S. would not take advantage. I'll put that in quotes. Now, by expanding the military alliance later, which of course was not done by Bush administration, that clearly was acting differently from the assurances we gave when we were encouraging Gorbachev to allow these things to happen peacefully. So I think there have been mistakes. And yes, these have intensified, perhaps, first the euphoria and then the reaction to it when you get the opposite. We're obviously, in terms of particularly of U.S.-Russian relations and also to a great degree EU-Russian relations, back almost to Cold War attitudes in some respects, though I think that there are important exceptions to that.